My fellow Asian and Pacific Islander Americans, Asian and Pacific Islanders in America, distinguished guests, allies, and friends. It is an honor to be here for this Rise Against Hate Oregon event during Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. May was chosen as Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month to coincide with two important milestones. First, the arrival of the first Japanese immigrants on May 7, 1843. And second, the contributions of Chinese workers to the Transcontinental Railroad, which was completed on May 10, 1869. Many Asians have come to America since these important milestones, some as immigrants, some as refugees, as students, as visitors. And they have come from all parts of Asia, the world's largest and most diverse continent, from East Asia to the Middle East to South Asia and all parts of the Pacific Islands. I myself came as an infant from Korea. I was born in Seoul, Korea, and am one of the hundreds of thousands of adoptees that were born and sent overseas. I started my journey on an orphanage doorstep. I was brought here, raised with American Caucasian parents. I grew up in white neighborhoods. I went to white schools. I grew up in a house where the starch of choice was potatoes, and truth be told, I don't know how to make rice. But that strictly American upbringing did not shield me from the experience of what it is like to be Asian in this country, because I walk around in this body and in this skin. And although this journey has been long and hard, I am proud to be both Asian and American. Today, I hope this is a day of solidarity for all Asians and Pacific Islanders in Oregon, in America, and a time for us to say, we are here, we belong, and for many of us, we will stay. But I hope that all of us can take a moment to reflect on the name of this program, Rise Against Hate Oregon. And I want to thank the speakers before me who have called out and brought attention to the tragic events in Atlanta on March 16th, 2021. Because although we are here in solidarity, in celebration, and in the spirit of collaboration, we should not ignore the fact that it took a horrendous act of mass violence against Asian Americans to spark a national conversation about violence and hate against our communities. We know that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are not the only groups targeted by hate and violence, and we stand in solidarity with our friends from the Black community, the Latinx community, the Native American community, the LGBTQ community, communities targeted by anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and all communities that have been victims of racism and oppression. And although we have seen this national conversation sparked, it's important to recognize that violence and hate against Asian Americans did not start on March 16th, 2021. Asian Americans have lived with a history of exclusion, discrimination, and violence since arriving in this country. May was chosen as Asian and Pacific American Heritage Month to celebrate some significant milestones that I described before. But there are other significant events in May that we don't talk about. On May 6, 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by Congress, the first law in the United States that targeted and barred immigration based on race. This followed on the heels of the Page Act of 1875, which largely targeted the exclusion of Chinese women who were stereotyped as promiscuous and assumed to be prostitutes. Right here in Oregon, in the month of May, the Hell's Canyon Massacre, otherwise known as the Snake River Massacre. This was the massacre of 34 Chinese gold miners who were ambushed and violently murdered by a group of white men. This was a coordinated, orchestrated attack against different groups of Chinese gold miners at different locations and at different times. And we only know the month of May because that is the month that their bodies washed down the river. Fast forward to present day. AAPIs across this country have been verbally and physically attacked at alarming rates. We've heard about some of the statistics and that documented increase in hate incidents against our communities during a time when the media and political leaders have been quick to pour fuel on anti-Asian sentiment and scapegoat us for the COVID-19 pandemic. The organization Stop AAPI Hate released a report last week, and we've heard these statistics, but it's important to let them sink in. a total 6,603 hate incidents from March 19th, 2020 to March 31st, 2021. In the first 3 months of 2021 alone, there were 2,410 hate incidents reported to stop AAPI hate. And of course, we know that this only reflects a fraction of the actual incidents, as many go underreported. In the statistics gathered by the Stop AAPI Hate, 64.8% of the reports were from women. The stereotypes and media portrayals of Asian women as submissive and vulnerable, along with the history of Asian women being over-sexualized, fetishized, and victimized, places a target on us as Asian women. And with the report of the Atlanta shootings, where 6 Asian women were murdered by a man claiming to try to eliminate the temptation of his sex addiction, we cannot ignore the intersectionality issues at play. Like many AAPI women, I woke up the day after the Atlanta shooting feeling a little less safe and a little more vulnerable. And I use the term a little because as an Asian American woman, that feeling of being vulnerable is not new. Growing up in a rural part of Oregon, I was the frequent target of verbal, physical, and emotional bullying because I was Asian. But as I got older and the intersectionality between my Asian race and my sex became more pronounced, I was confused about my treatment as an Asian woman, a mix of being fetishized and loved, but also hated at the same time. I remember an incident vividly on a school bus in high school. I was a freshman. A junior boy pulled a knife on me, called me a gook, told me to go home, but at the same time tried to kiss me and grope me. And I just remember being so confused as an Asian woman that I could not separate out what was happening to me based on both being Asian and as a woman. And the incidents that I've had to endure have ranged from what some might view as sort of harmless flirting or something that maybe I should, feel good about because people find me desirable. All of those incidents stem in some form of white supremacy. They stem from a notion that my body is not my own and that it only exists for somebody else's affection or infliction. I want to be clear to all of you who are listening. AAPI hate is not an AAPI issue. It is a dominant culture issue. It is a white supremacy issue. And while I am here to speak about my experience, to educate others, as you've heard from other speakers today, to talk about discrimination and hate against AAPIs, this may be our burden that has landed on us, but this is not our problem. We need those in the dominant culture, especially those who work within our institutions and systems that are steeped in institutional racism. Our governments, our institutions, our corporations, our educational learning. We need you to acknowledge this problem and to fix this problem. There are a number of government officials here and online listening, so I want to take a moment to outline just a few things that you and we can do to help move us forward to support Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. First, dispel the model minority myth. The model minority term was coined in 1966 in a New York Times article to describe Asian Americans who, despite marginalization, have achieved success. The subjects who are being described was a very small group of Japanese Americans. It was not and is not reflective of our community. The model minority myth is harmful to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. It is based on a false stereotype that we are inherently more successful and that we have achieved economic or educational success. It ignores the great diversity and wide disparity that exists in our communities. Because while some Asian Americans may have achieved educational or financial success, some of our communities, such as refugees from Southeast Asia, have some of the lowest rates of educational attainment and opportunity. In fact, Asians have now displaced African Americans as the most economically divided group in the United States. Among all racial and ethnic groups, Asians comprise the total biggest income gap between the top 10% and the bottom 10%. Second, take measures to disaggregate data for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Like the model minority stereotype, lumping all Asian Americans into one category ignores the diversity and disparity within our community. Data leads to the distribution of resources and access to services, and everything from healthcare to education is impacted by the quality of the data available to those making critical policy decisions that impact our communities. Third, for law enforcement and prosecutors, you must name and prosecute hate crimes for what they are. We always see this reluctance to label something or, not name it as a hate crime because we all know motive and intent is difficult to prove. But minimizing or ignoring the hate that motivates these acts dismisses the crux of the crime and often shifts the blame to the victims. We saw this in Atlanta in the shooting, where law enforcement and the media were reluctant to name it as an act of racism. And the narrative pivoted quickly to the all too familiar one of blaming the victims as assumed sex workers. We understand that it's a higher burden to prove, but accurately naming and charging these crimes legitimizes the experience and harm to a community that results when they are targeted simply because of our immutable characteristics. Finally, I want to call attention to and thank State Representatives Pham, Graber, Campos, Kropf, and Hudson, and State Senators Jama and Frederick for their push to use American Rescue Plan dollars to address several elements of AAPI hate. Their proposals include more funding to increase data reporting and tracking of hate incidents, the establishment of the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Advancement, creating a fund for nonprofits that would allow for the funding of affordable housing projects specific to the AAPI community, and creating a program to improve BIPOC mental health workers so that we have access to culturally competent mental health services. Please call your state legislators and ask them to support these proposals. We offer you these asks in the spirit of problem solving, collaboration, and for the betterment of the community, because this is our community. We are home, and we are here to stay.